Christians. Claiming that early Christians believed in the truth of your religion so much that they were willing to die for it is actually not the flex you think it is. I could take the low-hanging fruit and highlight how it demonstrates that Jesus' death on the cross then did not save the world, and that all things are not possible through Christ, and that apparently the Spirit of God will absolutely lead you where it will not protect you, but I want to take a different direction. The problem with the well-repeated claim is that it is rarely investigated or even truly considered on its merit. For example, in what ways does someone getting killed demonstrate the existence of a deity? It doesn't. It's not an experiment you would do to test that hypothesis. But even that is still low-hanging fruit. In today's conversation, we're going to take an objective look behind some of the claims, and by the end, I'll let you determine for yourself where this stuff should stand. Imagine a religion so fascinated with death that it exaggerates or even fabricates bloody tales of gore and martyrdom to inspire its young and faithful. Let me tell you what led me here. When I was still a Christian pastor, I was preparing to preach a sermon series about sacrifice, and I was going to use the different phases of Christian martyrdom to build a bridge of contemporization to everyday struggle. But when I went to do the research, I was incredibly disappointed in the source material for the narratives. I have a grandfather that I've never met. No one in my family would talk about him. I had to learn his history through source material, newspaper clippings, military records, and court transcripts. But when it comes to Christian history, much of it literally is, a Christian leader said this, so it's true. That's not inquiry, investigation, or any type of academic rigor. So let's do some of the work to unpack this. What is the historical evidence for early Christian persecutions? The earliest non-Christian account of Christians being punished comes from Pliny the Younger's correspondence with the emperor around AD 110. Pliny describes how he interrogated those denounced as Christians, offering them chances to recant by worshiping Roman gods and the imperial cult. Importantly, the emperor's reply instructs governors not to seek out Christians proactively, to accept recantations, and to disregard anonymous accusations. This exchange shows that prosecutions were local, ad hoc, and limited to those who refused to renounce their faith, rather than part of a systematic empire-wide campaign of terror until the later edicts of Diocletian of the early 4th century. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Now I want to talk about known exaggeration in later Christian histories. By the time of Constantine and beyond, church historians like Eusebius begin weaving martyr stories into a grand narrative of continuous suffering. As Edward Gibbon noted in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, these accounts often overstate both the number of victims and the brutality inflicted upon them. While Gibbon himself may have leaned toward skepticism, most modern historians agree that embellishment and selective retelling were common devices used to forge a united Christian identity and inspire emulation of the martyr's courage while crafting an effective red herring for their faith. Now, in general, a red herring is a logical fallacy where irrelevant information is introduced to distract from the main issue or argument. Martyrdom claims become a red herring when they are used to distract from examining the truthfulness or validity of the beliefs for which someone died. Again, this goes back to the note I made earlier that someone dying wouldn't be an experiment we'd run to test this hypothesis. The claim is that people wouldn't have died for it if it wasn't true. And for the uncritical mind, that sounds like it makes sense. The problem is a simple Google search of how many people have died for their beliefs, the Moonies, the Branch Davidians, the attack on 9/11, we find that not only have literal thousands of people died for their beliefs, but that different groups died for conflicting beliefs, demonstrating that dying for a belief is not an indicator of veracity of belief. Here's why martyrdom claims can be a red herring. Number one, sincerity versus truth. A person's willingness to die for their beliefs may demonstrate their sincerity, but it doesn't validate their beliefs as objectively true. And then also, you have to account for other motivations. Individuals may be motivated by factors other than the absolute truth of their beliefs, such as glory, belonging to a group, or even delusion. And then also, fabricated stories. Some stories of martyrdom are absolutely fabricated or exaggerated over time to enhance the credibility of a belief system for people who do not know how to use criticality and thought. When martyrdom claims are introduced to avoid addressing the core issues of the truthfulness of the belief themselves, they are constructed as red herrings and should be called out as such. These have been so effective in Christian apologetics that it is only until the recent century that modern scholarship has even been willing to investigate beyond the constructed herring, which, as I mentioned in an earlier video, Christianity's role in the Dark Ages had a lot to do with this. Now let's talk about the case of Polycarp, where there is possibly an authentic core here with a hagiographic overlay. The martyrdom of Polycarp is the earliest surviving acta martyrum outside the New Testament, purporting to record an eyewitness letter from Smyrna to Philomelium in the mid-2nd century. Yet, all surviving Greek manuscripts date from the 10th through the 13th centuries, and the version preserved by Eusebius omits key passion narrative elements. Scholars observe literary parallels to gospel accounts: a voice from heaven, arrest on a donkey, trial before a high magistrate, that suggest theological shaping more than strict reportage. While it may rest on a genuine memory of Polycarp's death, and that's a strong may, the narrative was recast to fit emerging Christian ideals of martyrdom. But there's another problem with Polycarp that is a very unpopular one. Modern academics themselves have begun questioning just how much unspoken assumptions have shaped our confidence in this martyr's existence. A 2010 study on the dating of Polycarp, rethinking the place of the martyrdom of Polycarp in the history of Christianity, argues precisely that most scholars have presumed the acta's authenticity without sufficiently interrogating those presuppositions, which many of you know as a sociological scholar, this is one of my main qualms with academic research on the history of Christianity. It shows how debates over the text, date, and provenance have often begun by treating the martyrdom account as if it were already authentic, rather than testing that assumption rigorously. There's only one potential non-literary trace of his existence. At Smyrna's Agora Basilica, researchers have found a scratched graffito that might read Polycarpos if you add poly and os alongside gladiatorial scenes. If genuine, it would be the sole archaeological hint that Polycarp's name circulated locally among pagans or non-Christian bystanders. But even this remains highly speculative, and no consensus has formed on its interpretation. Now, what does this mean for historic certainty? No pagan or official record names Polycarp. All references come from Christian writers. Even textual critics who strip away later hagiographic layers still work from the assumption that a core eyewitness tradition existed. True scholarly rigor, were it to demand external non-sectarian attestation, would force us to admit that Polycarp's life and death rest on Christian documentary chains alone, and that those chains were never independently tested in antiquity. The bottom line is, if our standard is proof in the hands of a completely neutral observer, the case for Polycarp is as thin as it is for most early bishops, plausible and coherent within the Christian literary tradition, but not verifiable by non-Christian sources. Modern scholarship knows this and continues to debate how much weight we should give to those internal attestations versus the strictest criteria of historical proof. Ultimately, the question remains open, not settled by consensus. Let's talk about some invented legends and theological motives. Beyond Polycarp, many martyr acts, such as those of Domnina, Berenice, and Prostos, appear only in later homilies and pans of church fathers like John Chrysostom. Contemporary feminist scholarship argues these stories were intentionally reshaped to promote norms of elite Christian motherhood and piety, rather than to record historical events. In fact, the great persecution that took place under Diocletian himself, though the most severe, produced far fewer documented executions than later legends claim. Estimates range from 3,000 to 23,000 over a decade, with only a fraction of those names being known by reliable sources. But there's even a problem when you look at the numbers. You have to ask the question, how many early Christians were actually Roman citizens? Before AD 212, Roman citizenship was still a relatively exclusive status. At the death of Augustus in AD 14, only about 4 to 7% of the empire's inhabitants held full Roman citizenship. By the mid-2nd century, enfranchisement had crept upward. Scholars like Miles Levin estimates that at most 20 to 25% of free people were citizens prior to Caracalla's universal grant in AD 212. If early Christian communities roughly mirrored their local populations in legal status, then only a small minority of Christians would have been citizens. At the very start, when Christianity numbered perhaps 7,500 adherents out of some 60 million people, the overlap with the 4 to 7% citizen pool means only a few hundred pagan law-protected Christians could have even claimed citizen privileges. That number rising to maybe a few thousand by the mid-2nd century as both Christian numbers and enfranchisement grew. So what's the implication? Most of the martyrs we read about in later hagiographies were non-citizens, slaves, freedmen, provincials, whose trials and executions fell under provincial governors' authority, not under Rome's stricter citizens' rights jurisdictions. Which means for the persecutions that occurred in these cases, they would not have been based on religious edicts. Christianity's martyr narrative thus inherited a broad legal framework originally aimed at any refusal of public worship, then rebranded it around the Christian confession. So let's further unpack the myth of persecution. In her influential book, The Myth of Persecution, Candida Moss argues that almost every classic martyr tale was edited, forged, or outright invented after the fact. She maintains that early Christians experienced only sporadic localized legal actions, limited to at most 12 years under specific emperors, and that later generations adapted and embellished these accounts to establish a martyr complex central to Christian identity politics. According to Moss, none of the stories are completely historically accurate, and their primary function was didactic and polemical rather than documentary. While genuine acts of witness unto death undoubtedly occurred, the majority of Christian martyr narratives were subject to significant exaggeration, fabrication, and hagiographic invention. Early non-Christian sources confirm only limited, sporadic prosecutions. Most of our detailed stories derive from later Christian writers who shaped them to serve theological, communal, and political ends. A critical approach, comparing contemporary pagan records, archaeological evidence, and literary analysis, reveals that the heroic core of these martyrdoms is often swaddled in layers of legend and rhetorical flourish. Further study in primary sources and modern scholarship is essential for distinguishing historical kernel from devotional fiction. I hope you're ready to go deeper in this conversation, because the next topic is the impiety conflation problem. The deeper you dig, the more problems you find. While there are instances where Christians are mentioned specifically in the case of these alleged persecutions, as we see with Pliny the Younger, we find many more of these stories that didn't originate with the claim of Christianity or any God belief at all. You see, Rome's laws against impietas, or impiety, were aimed at anyone who refused the public cult, not Christians specifically. As a matter of fact, there's good evidence that many of the people exiled or martyred under the impiety laws were atheists. Christianity later framed those same legal mechanisms as a specifically Christian persecution, even though under Roman law the penalties applied equally to atheists, Jews, who were seen as atheists for some reason, Epicureans, and any other group that skipped the sacrifices owed to the state. Now, under Domitian, the charge of atheism was wielded broadly. Cassius Dio reports that Flavius Clemens, the emperor's cousin, and others were condemned for atheism, a label often applied to Jews, Christians, or anyone refusing the emperor's cult, and some of these accused were executed, others at least deprived of property. Roman jurists never had a single term exactly equivalent to atheist in the modern sense. Instead, any refusal to honor the state's god could be prosecuted as impietas, while choosing to honor different gods was prosecuted as superstitio, unauthorized or unverified religious practice. These offenses threatened the pax deorum, the peace of the gods, and so were treated as serious crimes against the community. Now, the Greeks shared a similar practice, for which they used the word atheotes. Under Domitian, suspicion of impiety extended to intellectuals. In AD 94, he issued an edict expelling all philosophers from Rome, many of whom were labeled atheists for teaching doctrines that questioned divine involvement in the world. Epictetus, for instance, relocated to Nicopolis in Greece under this decree. And then there's also the curious case of Flavius Clemens. Titus Flavius Clemens, once consul alongside Domitian and his cousin by blood, was executed on a charge of atheism shortly after leaving office. Cassius Dio, of maternal Greek origin, explicitly links his condemnation to impiety, or atheetos, noting that Clemens' wife, Flavia Domitilla, was banished for the same crime. Now, for those of you who may not know, Titus Flavius Clemens is not just a random name. He's often cited by apologists as an early martyr for the confession of his belief in Christianity. Let's see what the first paragraph of his Wikipedia page has to contribute to the conversation. Titus Flavius TFT N. Clemens, AD 95, was a Roman politician and cousin of the Emperor Domitian, with whom he served as consul from January to April in AD 95. Shortly after leaving the consulship, Clemens was executed, allegedly for atheism, although the exact circumstances remain unclear. Over time, he came to be regarded as an early Christian martyr. You have to wonder how something like that happens without intentional misrepresentation of history to support a narrative that has no support of its own. Let's continue with the persecution that gets left out of the story. The persecution that often goes undiscussed is that same one that has discouraged progress, destroyed libraries, decapitated sciences, and decimated societies. It is the persecution that made it damn right traumatic to even consider anything beyond the company line. Across histories, individuals labeled as atheists or accused of impiety, disrespect to the gods, have faced harsh sanctions, from exile and execution to social and legal marginalization. In ancient Greece and Rome, philosophers who questioned the gods could be banished or prosecuted. Anaxagoras was expelled from Athens around 450 BC for impiety, and Diogenes of Melos, called the atheist, was similarly exiled for atheism. He was actually an early atheist preacher. How about that? Atheist preachers existed before Christian preachers. Isn't that beautiful? Socrates himself was condemned to death in 399 BC on charges of corrupting youth and denying the state's gods. Under emperors like Domitian, the label atheist, was applied broadly to anyone who refused the imperial cult or traditional deities, resulting in property confiscations, exile, or execution, even for members of the aristocracy, such as Flavius Clemens. There was also the Dum Diversas of 1452. What was it? It was a papal bull issued on the 18th of June in 1452 by Pope Nicholas. It authorized King Alfonso of Portugal to fight, subjugate, and conquer those rising against the Catholic faith and struggling to extinguish Christian religion, namely the Saracens, Muslims, and pagans. Now, the document consigned warring enemies that lost to perpetual servitude. In its own words, and this is why this is important, it says, "We grant to you by these present documents, with our apostolic authority, full and free permissions to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate and convert to the use and profit of yourself and your successors, the King of Portugal, in perpetuity." That little line about unbelievers often gets overlooked in this papal bull. But then even in early modern Europe, the 16th to 17th centuries, the Inquisition and secular courts often conflated atheism with heresy or blasphemy. French printer Étienne Dolet was burned at the stake in 1546, and Italian philosopher Giulio Cesare Vanini suffered the same fate in Toulouse in 1619, accused of denying divine providence. In Poland, nobleman Kazimierz Łóżeński offered a treatise on the non-existence of God before being tried and beheaded for atheism in 1689, the most famous legal execution for non-belief in that era. And mind you, notice I said the most famous, not the only. Scotland's Thomas Aikenhead was the last person in Great Britain executed for blasphemy, hanged in Edinburgh at age 20 in 1697 after admitting to denying the Trinity in Scripture under rigorous trial procedures. There's also been 19th century legal marginalization. In Victorian England, atheists could not swear religious oaths in court. Poet Percy Shelley was expelled from Oxford for the necessity of atheism, and MP Charles Bradlaugh was repeatedly refused the right to affirm his parliamentary oath, delaying his seating until 1886. And let us not forget apostasy laws in the Islamic world. In at least 10 countries today, Afghanistan, Iran, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, and others, apostasy, often equated with atheism, remains a capital offense under Sharia-based legal codes. The 2021 Freedom of Thought report found death penalty provisions for apostasy in these nations, though enforcement varies. Even where legal penalties have fallen away, atheists often face discrimination. U.S. surveys show Americans are less willing to vote for, hire, or trust atheists compared with nearly any other minority group, reflecting deep-rooted cultural suspicions despite First Amendment protections. And this is something that has severely impacted my own life for the past decade. Over millennia, atheism has been treated not merely as a private perspective, but as a public threat to civic order, religious unity, or state security, resulting in punishments ranging from loss of rights and exile to torture and execution. My journey began with a simple sermon series on sacrifice, hoping to draw lessons from heroic martyrs and connect their trials to our daily struggles. Instead, I found a tangle of half-truths, secondhand legends, and circular sourcing that would make uncovering my own grandfather's history seem straightforward by comparison. Where I expected solid ground, external verification, legal records, contemporary eyewitness accounts, I encountered nothing but centuries of retelling, hagiographic flourishes, and legions of inconvenient exaggerations and outright fabrications. That realization isn't just academic nitpicking. When we lean on unverified tales of martyrdom as proof of the gospel's authenticity, we risk committing the very logical misstep those stories themselves betray, mistaking sincerity for veracity and veneration for evidence. Dying for a cause, no matter how noble, does not certify its truth. History shows us that people have perished for conflicting creeds, for political rebellion, for error, and yes, for even genuine conscience. The martyr's death is powerful, but it is not substitute for proof. So where do we go from here? We reclaim our right and responsibility to demand rigorous sourcing, to weigh primary documents above inherited lore, and to recognize red herrings when they're used to shield belief from scrutiny. If we truly value the lessons of sacrifice, let us honor them not by uncritical acceptance of embellished legends, but by facing down uncertainty with the same courage we extol on our heroes. Only then can we build a life and a world anchored not in myth, but in the hard-won clarity of honest inquiry. Listen, if you're enjoying these types of conversations, consider taking a deeper dive by heading over to Window Shop and checking out our digital accompaniment guides. For the past few months, I've been attaching a guide to nearly every video to give people just like you something to expand your personal study and even have the tools to build group conversations. You can also get unlimited access to all of our digital content by joining my Patreon at any membership above safety, as well as access to a monthly conference call with me and our growing community, like the one coming up this month. Well, that's all I have for now. Thank you all for joining me today, and until next time, keep rising.